made this out of a curtain. No, actually this time it was 3 curtains and a bed sheet. So it's spring.
Spring check, an actual spring. Lovely weather, not so lovely weather, terrible freaking weather. Treacherous birds who fled the country when the ships were down are back in town.
I don't know if you've noticed, because there's kind of this thing going on where you can't go outside, and it sucks.
That was kind of a sarcastic, I mean, obviously it sucks for many other reasons.
So even though we can't enjoy spring as it should be enjoyed, spring weather still calls for cute, sustainable spring outfits. And what better way to use newfound time than cut something up, stitch it back together, flip it over, find something new, something cuter, also called a thrift flip, because who said you can't go thrifting in your own closet? For the skirts I'll be flipping in this video, I actually thrifted before this pandemic, but every day I'm finding new things around the house that I could give a makeover.
Including myself. A few months ago I actually bought blonde box dye, which I know won't make me blonde. Trust me, I've been Asian ginger before. I just wanted lighter brown hair. Anywho, I've been too scared to use it because need I say it again, I've been Asian ginger before. But I realized if there's any time to go bold, preferably not bald, it is now.
And finally, we should get into this video, but actually first I would like to say to anyone who is accidentally watching this, hi, I hope you're healthy and doing fine. And now we can start.
Okay, so here we have it. Actually, did I say we were starting? I'm sorry. Only recently, unfortunately, I realized that there's an uneven, I'll say unfair range of sizes at charity shops and thrift stores. Particularly, there is a lot of less clothing for plus sizes. I'm not sure what the reason is, but one could assume it is because the fashion industry itself is not rightfully inclusive. Anywho, I thrifted these skirts a while back before I realized this, but I've decided not to buy bigger sizes, because everyone should have the same opportunity to thrift and shop sustainably. I'm sorry, okay, now let's get into it. For me, oversized skirt. So I took it in a bunch and used the fabric to make the overalls top, and I also took some off the top to make it shorter. And I used this to make the top as well. Then I seam ripped the side open as well as the elastic. I measured and cut the elastic to fit my waist. I wanted it to still be a bit gathered and not too tight, so I cut it off just a little bit too big, and I measured where to cut.
So now I'm just making sure that the piece that I want to cut out is gonna be enough.
Exactly, that is always good to do before you cut anything. Then lucky for me, it was gingham, so I could cut a straight line just by looking at one square. So here's the top of the skirt where the elastic waistband used to be, but we took it out. So then I cut that off with my rotary cutter and I made it into a long strap using a safety pin which I pushed through so the inside was on the outside. Then I cut the long strap in half to make 2 straps. So here I'm folding over the top of the skirt to make room for the fitted elastic waistband. Had I done it now though, I would have folded it over doubled and hemmed. Then I just sewed that down with a straight stitch. Then I fed the elastic through using a safety pin. And then I sewed the little check box to fasten the elastic. Then I sewed down that open side, which had I done it now I would have done before sewing down the top of the skirt. Now moving on to the top, as pattern I used an overall dress that I already had and traced around it. It is a very simple shape though, so if you don't have an overall you can just look at a picture of one and trace it out. Then I cut that front and back piece out with my rotary cutter. So what I did here was folding in all the sides of the top. I actually did this quite a while ago now and I've learned a lot. So what I would do now would be to hem it, so I would have just folded them in twice instead of once. So then I sewed down all those sides using a straight stitch. Okay, so when I cut out the front and back piece, I suppose I didn't add enough seam allowance. When I pinned both pieces together and tried it on, they were a bit too tight. So what I did was to cut out 2 small squares of fabric and added one to each side, one of which was great for making an opening into the top, which I made with small buttons. Oh, actually somewhere here I cut one of the squares into 2 so I could make one with buttonholes and one for buttons. So then I zigzagged and folded over the edges of those 3 squares. Then I went ahead and made 3 buttonholes for the opening and attached 3 buttons. So then I attached those 3 square pieces to the sides of the top. Just sewing right over the already existing seam. Then I also had to make buttonholes in the front piece and attach big buttons to the straps. Then because I hadn't hemmed and the top was fraying a lot, I had to serge, or well, I can't afford a serger, so zigzag the edges all around the top. And for the very last step of this top, I sewed down the straps to the back. Okay, so moving on to the next flip. Well, again, I had to take it in quite a bit, and the excess fabric was used to make a top. First of all, though, I didn't really like the pants looking detail of the visible zipper and the button, so I decided to remove those and replace the opening with an invisible zipper. Upon removing those with my seam ripper, I continued all the way down to create an opening and make it simpler to take in. So this skirt I wanted fitted tightly, so I took it in a bunch, only leaving a few centimeters of seam allowance for the zipper. Then I pinned the invisible zipper with the top side of the zipper facing down on the right side of the fabric. So the top of the zipper with the zipper tape I pinned down to the inside of the skirt, so once sewed down it would be hidden on the inside of the skirt. Then I sewed that down with my zipper foot as close to the zipper teeth as possible. So then I pinned the rest of the opening beneath the zipper down. This ended up being a little bit tricky as it ended up on a pleat. Basically, it was really important that I pinned it and sewed it down as straight as possible. What I did was to sew it down with a basting stitch, which basically is the longest stitch on your machine, or sew it down by hand, but I couldn't be bothered. So I baste stitched and I seam ripped open, and I baste stitched and I seam ripped open, and finally it ended up a little less wonky than at the first try, so I decided to be content and not go insane. So for the rest of this day, I was very tired from all the trial and error, which only really felt like errors. So I didn't film the last few steps. Basically, when I was happy with the basting stitch, I sewed it down with a regular stitch, and where it was taken in, I cut some excess fabric off and zigzagged the edges. So the first step for making the top was to take that piece of excess fabric and make it as big as possible, so I had to remove the top and waist lining, as well as the button and buttonhole, and I also had to seam rip a few pleats. So I also decided to seam rip open what had been the skirt's hemmed bottom. I made sure the fabric was enough to make one front and one back piece. So I had this design in mind that was kind of like a tank top so that I could have shirts under it. So I started off using one of my dresses with a tank top as a pattern. This dress was of a very stretchy fabric, so I ended up really only using it as a very loose outline. Before this, I also took my bust measurements to make sure it wouldn't be too tight. I've generally come to the conclusion that you don't really need a specific and really great pattern to make something. You just really need to start somewhere. Oh, and it's great to start too big and not too small. And then just making adjustments as you go to make sure it fits. Or I don't know, this might just be an excuse for my cryptic looking pattern. Then I pinned that final cutout of the "can we please call it pattern" on this thin white cotton fabric that I used as an inner layer aligning because the blue fabric was a little itchy and we're not about that. So I pinned and cut it out on a fold because I wanted one front piece and one back piece, and yes, I used the same pattern for the front and the back, and there are reasons for this, not just laziness. Then I split this weird one piece into two by cutting it on the fold. Now I pinned those together just to try it on. I was very much stabbed throughout this whole clip in numerous places, so if you decide to take pity on me, you can like this video and subscribe to this channel, and I guarantee more of my blood will be spilled. So unfortunately, it was at this point I realized I had made a mistake. It was not that big of a deal, but I did feel a great deal stupid. So basically the mistake I made was when I was making the pattern, I added a few centimeters seam allowance everywhere, so I could hem everything because the blue fabric was fraying like its life depended on it. But at this point in the process, I realized my intentions were to use this white muslin as the lining and sew them together, which meant I would not have to hem, just zigzag the edges. It wasn't too big of a deal everywhere, but especially those big straps. I only wanted the strap to be about 3 or 4 centimeters, and I had made it 10. But that's alright, that's okay. You may think that you're okay. I try not to feel too bad about the waste of fabric, but don't you worry, I saved all my scraps, even the tiniest bits. Before pinning anything down, I ironed the piece because the pleats had created speed bumps. This clip had the potential of being very satisfying, but how does one iron? Okay, now the row was clear and I could place out the patterns, air quotes, on the fabric in different ways to test out and minimize the waste of fabric. There wasn't that much left, but I really want to make something out of it, and I'm not sure what, maybe a little scrunchy. Once I had decided on the optimal positions, I traced it out with a chalk. Not a chalk, like a chalk, like one of those that you use to a blackboard, like, you know, those black, yeah. Anywho, so then I cut those out. Even though all the ugly edges were going to be on the inside, I decided to zigzag all the edges of the blue fabric. I'm not sure why though, I just feel like it's so sloppy, and what if a thread falls out, and like, I guess I do have a little fear that like, what if it frays so much that the seam rips, like, I don't know. So then to merge the lining with the outer facing layer, I pinned them together, right sides together. Oh yeah, not to forget, I separated in the back right down the middle to make a button up, and then just zigzagging those edges as well. And I went back to pinning, and then I sewed. Okay, I guess I didn't sew. So here's a questionable part. What's going on? So this idiot did not like the water resolvable pen markings that would have gone away in the freaking not car wash, in the freaking laundry machine. Well, actually, it would have probably gone away in the car wash as well. Not recommended, and it took forever to dry, which did not stop me from pinning it together, and that is why it will look gross. Finally, I sewed all the pieces together, leaving the sides that will not have the buttons and buttonholes. Then I went straight to my ironing board to smooth out the edges nicely. However, I did not film this because, as I previously stated, my ironing skills are subpar. Basically, I tried to iron so that the white parts were the least amount of visible as possible. Okay, so here's the thing. About what is time anymore? About a month ago, when I first heard of isolation and school shutting down, I went to my local fabric store, in which I never buy fabrics because I always just go to my local secondhand store and buy curtains instead. But this is where I get my supply of threads and buttons. Since I kind of sensed my school was going to be shut down in a matter of days, it did 2 days later, I decided to do a small stock up, so I just bought some white buttons. So these are the buttons I bought. 2 different sizes, and it's not that big a difference, but I'm unsure. Yeah, then I did that, and undid that, and shoved them around to try to make up my mind, and I decided on 4 smaller buttons. So I made 4 buttonholes. I already tried my luck on this piece. Please work out. Okay. Yay! Okay. Then to make actual holes, I took my seam ripper and ripped some holes. Then to mark where the button should be in relations to the buttonholes, you put the buttonholes on top of where the button should be, and then you shove the chalk around in the holes. So then I attached the buttons, and for the 3 buttons from the bottom up, I decided to make diagonal stitches because I think it looks classic and cute. At first I only did a few stitches in each hole so I could try it on and make sure everything was straight and that the buttons fit into the buttonholes correctly. And then I went back to the machine and really secured them in place. Then it was finally time to attach the 2 back pieces to the front piece, right sides together, pinning and sewing. So then I guess the sun decided not to wait around for me to get my lazy ass outside and get some fresh air anymore, so I went outside to catch the sunset. So I tried to make a time lapse of the sun actually setting, and I would like to credit the geese and other extremely loud bird forms that hang around the field outside my house for making the clip interesting. And also some credit to my sister for commentating on these birds and talking me out of befriending them and inviting them over. They look kind of like small horses. I don't know if you want to, they'll poop a lot. To spice up this top, I made a little ruffle out of this white curtain fabric with small embroidery on it that I was going to add to the neckline from the back to the front. So to make the ruffle, I hemmed both sides of it, and then to gather it, I sewed a straight stitch with the longest stitch length on the machine all the way along the long strip of fabric. Then I would just like to acknowledge that I actually cleaned the table. That has definitely seen better days. It didn't come out any cleaner, but at least it shined. Then I lightly tugged on the top thread to gather it. So then when it was as gathered as I wanted, I pinned it to the entire top of the top. So what you're seeing right now is actually my first attempt, and I did think it was a little bit too gathered, so I went back and I de-gathered it and then pinned it right on again. So now when I was happy with the gathering, I sewed it down with a straight stitch. And since the ruffle was too long, I cut it off to the proper length at the back, then hemmed that piece and then sewed that in place. And now for the final reveal. The voice recorder did that by itself, I promise. Okay, and now for the final reveal. Here's the swan. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to, you could subscribe, but if you don't want to, you should also subscribe.